Thank you so much. Angela has just spoken so eloquently that I don't think there's very much left for me to say, but we're condemned to it. First of all, I would like, of course, to thank Trinity College very much for issuing this decidedly daunting invitation to me. I would like to thank John Marenborn of Trinity for dealing with many of the logistics and arrangements, and also to thank Angela Layton again for her help with setting all of this up. I should say that I have 4 talks to give. They are, or my hope was that they would be cumulative in their arguments, or at least their suggestions, but should also be relatively self-contained. I've got no visual diversions for you at all. You are simply condemned to hear me bumbling on into the dusk until I get to the end of my first script. And I just want to add that these talks won't be at all manifesto-like. Rather, they're going to be clusters of conjectures on my part. And they will reflect on aspects of the writing of lyric that seem to have slipped into the twilight. Poetry existing largely on the page, that is. For instance, on how the writer might position herself without submitting to a contemporary aggrandizing of the poetic persona. Could some very different historical conceptions be helpful here, perhaps of the author's lesser significance? So my topics will include how, in a world of reverberating noise, a modern quasi-anonymity or impersonality could conduct itself, pertaining not only to the writer, but to the poem itself in its solitary standing. Quote, "A work of art has an author, and yet, when it is perfect, it has something which is essentially anonymous about it." And that's Simone Weil in her book Gravity and Grace. But why might such considerations be remotely of any interest at the moment? They are not occupied with the practicalities of dissemination, of getting the work read. And they're not questions which will concern all writers' temperaments, vary enormously, of course. But for those writers of lyric who are overwhelmed by the apparent imperatives of self-promotion, it could be reassuring to recall quite other approaches to writing which have existed, including some half-forgotten traditions which minimize the persona of the poet. And so these talks will in part be saying, let there be room for downplaying the pursuit of so-called mastery too. Or, from the point of view of the lyric itself, do current tendencies to burnish the author's biography militate against its own flourishing? Arguably, if anything needs to find its own voice, it's the poem, not the poet. A reduced focus on the poet's person wouldn't, I think, curtail her writing's range or subject matter, nor condemn it to being shrunken or parochial. Ambition for the work's generosity of scope isn't to be conflated with instrumental or, quote, career, unquote, driven ambition. Any more humane version of public life would be far removed from our platformed and artificially worked up competitiveness. In pursuit of their, I hope, helpful reflections, the authors I'll be drawing on throughout these talks will include, although sketchily, Heinrich von Kleist, Friedrich Schiller, John Stuart Mill, Jan Mukarowski, Michel Foucault, Jack Spicer, W.S. Graham, Fanny Howe and Peter Gizzi. I'll trace some meditations on underemphasized authorship in favor of inclining towards the quote-unquote dictated nature of the poem. But where I linger on linguistic or specifically poetic dispossession, it'll be a cheerful sort of dispossession. For wouldn't it be more helpful to consider, quote, creativity, unquote, as a property of language itself rather than of persons? For myself, I'd much prefer to bring out the inhuman aspect of poetry. John Keats' assertion that, quote, we hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us is soon followed by his gaiety. How beautiful are the retired flowers! How would they lose their beauty were they to throng into the highway, crying out, admire me, I am a violet. Dote upon me, I am a primrose. Such floral self-proclaiming would fall hard on anyone for whom the present apparent obligation to be seen lies heavy. While very many writers may feel at ease in a climate of well-advertised reward, a few others won't, and it's my wager that the few others consist of maybe more creatures than myself alone. My conviction is that feelings are held in common, and this is my bet. Such people may be by nature reserved, although when I wrote that word, I thought that perhaps the very idea of a reserved temperament has come to sound antiquated or plain incomprehensible. While the requirement to publicly compete might be accepted by some, or even by many, as a badge of welcome recognition, for others it could cause deep embarrassment or frank bewilderment, especially if your family, educational, or class background didn't kit you out with self-confidence, or at least with the know-how to mime that self-confidence. So I thought that here some historical polemics about any author's relative unimportance might just offer some consolation, or at least distraction, for anyone else subdued by the current emphasis on narrowly defined achievement, measured in fanfares of poets declared to be pitted against poets. For if the nature of lyric itself arguably leans towards impersonality, or better, I think, to what I want to call transpersonality, then its clash with heavily underlined personalities might well be jarring. But I'll repeat that I'm not advocating for any particular alternative, but simply trying to dig out some approaches to writing which seem to have been half buried. I admit my own quirks here. Still, I'd be speculating that this particular oddball's feeling of awkwardness at the goal of the poetic, quote, career, unquote, may accord in some way with the nature of lyric itself, in that the freedom to not calculate in advance about how your work will be received is essential, not just for your sake, but for its. There's a huge and awkward gap between the clamour surrounding poetry and the solitary circumstances of its production. Especially, I think, for younger writers, this gulf between writing's experience and its mandatory display can cause dejection. A volatile media which, not to deny its many advantages, issues a clatter of publicity and promotional activities, seems a cruel culture in which a few are garlanded for being shortlisted for annual prizes, as if these accidents of fortune were unassailable literary credentials constituting serious literary criticism. And where the speediest accolade is that chilling adjective, quote, award-winning, as in, quote, the award-winning poet X. No doubt prize shortlistings do draw a wider attention to the books themselves and do attract new readers. Yet, the fact that the largest and richest prizes aren't just quietly bestowed, as they could well be, but instead have to be visibly, quote, vied for, unquote, surely distracts from the writing itself in favour of the spectacle of the writers led by the reins across lime-lit public stages to trot as if in a gymkhana. Nervy ponies, rosettes clamped onto their ears, bright ribbons in their manes. Though what about the conviction that it's your authorial responsibility to become highly visible, to advocate for your overlooked, misinterpreted, or neglected grouping? But I still want to say that it remains true that discomfort about this heavy weighting on the author's persona can be felt by anyone, however dedicated to whatever cause. Political conviction won't always arrange the kind of misgivings that I've been mentioning. Then, my question is still, how could some writers become less embarrassed by the noisy self-advocacy which accompanies the writing? Or is it an obnoxious grey privilege for white-haired me, able to back myself away from it, even to raise such a question? My apprehensions that when too much is attributed purely to the writer's quote-unquote mastery, a lopsided burden weighs down any author with a reticent temperament. Her awkwardness at being hailed as a poet, her willingness to be thought opaque or even slippery in the interest of keeping a low profile, may sound frankly mad to most listeners. Nevertheless, that, quote, I wouldn't call myself a poet, unquote, phenomenon can't be put down purely to a will to self-effacement. And of course, that will is conventionally ascribed to women. But a musician wouldn't expect to be interviewed on set about her personal reasons for taking up the saxophone as if this were key to understanding her performing life. Yet now everything conspires to promote the biography and achievements of the poet, which can be especially tough on the young writer who must market herself to be marketed, whatever her inclination. We've no idea about how many may avoid giving public readings out of a perfectly ordinary shyness, or out of an understandable reluctance to be seen via video conferencing, which so heavily emphasizes the face and highlights any oddity or disfigurement or deviation from a norm of good looks, but without having the compensation of full physical presence. Uttering draws attention to yourself, however reluctantly you do it. Your voice is as much you as is your face, and arguably more so, since your voice won't wrinkle and sag until it's unrecognizable. And you're the focus of eyes as well as ears. The obligation to be on view means that you become an object of scrutiny to yourself as well as to others, at once heard and self-overhearing. Much will turn on how the speaker senses herself to be positioned, whether she's confident of being perceived as in sympathy with her hearers or as in some way, quote-unquote, foreign, standing out alone. the contingencies of any voice, its pitch, its tone, its dialect, intensify the usual vagaries of speaking. Anyone with an erratic stammer or too shaky a command of a language not their first, or who'd taken to heart their years of being berated by the old injunction that children should be seen and not heard, will feel awkwardly exposed when they must raise their voice on a platform. They have to launch themselves into fully audible performance, yet can never be confident that their own articulation and articulacy can support them. Given all of this, some very different inclinations might recommend themselves. For instance, towards receptivity rather than frantic production, towards a patient attentiveness, a tolerance of hesitancy, a capacity for quasi-anonymity, a listening stillness. Also a degree of reticence and reserve, perhaps a readiness to wait. Enunciating these possibilities alone might come as a faint relief to those writers, however few, who are daunted by the seeming imperatives of self-exhibiting, of being an untiring presence. To draw back might conceivably accord with writing poems with more clarity, less bluster. However, all of this seems to me, in part, a doubtful and a timidly dull notion. And it's largely centered on an assumed and blandly reasonable psychology, or even an idealization, you might say, of the writer. And here I'm aware that describing human characteristics could muddle them up with the hoped-for characteristics of the poem itself. It's not that modesty and reticence will necessarily produce stronger poetry. A personally vicious poet can make the sweetest sounds. But to leave aside authorial tempers, emerging poems might be able to breathe more freely if their rate of production is eased and their authors can take the time they need. Suppose so that we were to shift those characteristics of receptivity away from the author towards the lyric poem itself, and we locate impersonality there. For impersonality doesn't have to be set against or preclude the personal, if, that is, we recast our notion of the personal to include someone's formative experiences of reading and listening to the work of many, many others. As for the assertion, quote, I write, versus the claim that, quote, I'm written, I'd be wondering what advantage might be gained by tilting the balance away from the former commonsensical end and instead some way towards the unwritten end. The familiar approach here would imagine the poet galloping, wielding the lasso of, quote, craft, unquote, after a shyly fleeting diction. But undo this caricature and we're facing many forms of linguistic dispossession, some harsher, as a sufferer from Tourette's syndrome could testify, but some more easygoing, like a benign play of echoes. My own feeling is still that the work of writing poetry does largely dispossess the writer. Her realization of the sheer accidents entailed in writing might make her disavow the credit accorded to her for what in fact are the felicities of language. Maybe a relaxed dreaminess of being, quote unquote, dictated to sets in here. At the least, her overall impression is of being less uniformly in control of her work than her critics assume. And this seems to me to be a solidly fair attitude. Yet a certain patience in the author's stance doesn't entail passivity in her language. From the side of the poem, dispossession could include its exuberance, its leaping ahead of the writer, its tics of echolalia, its tuberous branching underground, its, quote, musicality, crucially including cadence and other strong powers of prosody. Also, of course, its accidental homonyms, internal sound echoes, involuntary sonic trails, and its unintended self-plagiarism. This outerness of language is also carried intimately in the private head. The word inspiration does sound ludicrously dated, but its literal meaning of breathing in does have the great merit of conveying language's arrival from the outside. The noisy anonymity of the speech of the outside meets the differently noisy anonymity of the inside or interior speech. It's on that nameless blur between language and writer that the poem is forming. To dwell on such an edge isn't, I think, a cognitive weakness, but an advantage. For this notion of threshold could be a better way of thinking about the familiar antithesis of, quote, writer is being dictated to versus, quote, writer mastering the language, unquote. Or might it be more plausible to nudge these oscillating questions of agency well away from the poet and straight onto the poem itself? And so these will be my preoccupations in my 4 talks. And it seemed only fair to spell them out to you now, and then you can skip listening and attending anymore if they're not what you had in mind when you arrived. And so today, I'll move away from generalities and we'll start with a surprising discovery of the importance of live speaking to forming a new thought, even if it might be too much born of its occasion to be retained for long in its speaker's memory, and how this demonstrates the self-steering capacities of language, a phenomenon I want to emphasize in relation to the writing of poems. I'm sure that most of us have long since become weary of Zoom and its ilk. My own disaffection with it wasn't really due to my technophobia, but because the longer our bizarre on-screen existences became entrenched, the more I became interested in what, pre-pandemic, had never been much remarked, but made itself felt once it was lost. That is the full presence of other human beings, and how that presence enables our capacity for thinking, as well as for feeling, attending, and conversing. Or conversely, what precisely was it about those flattened on-screen rectangles boxing in each face that so diminished what we could say and hear, which isn't to ignore the fact that people's reactions, again, differ hugely. What had mercifully, for some of us, been ruled out in quarantine was that often frightening experience of speaking in person in front of others. But something extraordinary was revealed. Did this newly enforced suspension of something I dreaded, having to talk in public, shed some light on how the struggle to articulate a thought had once worked? What was it about the presence of a live audience, even an audience of one, that could let a speaker be carried along by her own speaking, so that all her self-consciousness about her voice, her presence, her lack of fluency and so on would crumple and fall away because something else could forcefully take over. Something which might be loss of one kind of linguistic control, yet in the same breath could be oddly productive. Then exactly how could another human presence enable our verbal inventiveness? ways in which speaking to another person in the flesh might bring us to say things that we hadn't anticipated, things we didn't even know that we would ever say. For this experience really does not fit with the standard notions as to how spoken language works. It's nothing to do with communication or conveying your thoughts, nor is it a matter of a straightforward dictation from inside to outside, as if my utterance were a translation of my ideas. Rather than being preformed in the mind, that is, thought really can be, quote, made in the mouth, or, from the French, thought, quote, makes itself in the mouth, as Tristan Tzara famously proclaimed in his 7 Dada manifestos of 1924. In this vein, someone can voice what she herself hasn't understood until a moment it's out, and then she'll feel herself at the mercy of heaven knows what nameless verbal force. There can be real astonishment for a speaker at what she'll find herself voicing before an audience, a rush of words running along their own racetrack. A sharp discovery in hears, in this curious aspect of language, when, in that pregnant remark of Merleau-Ponty's, quote, my spoken word surprises me and teaches me my thought. But perhaps this could be put more vigorously. My spoken word can be my thought, even if that thought's fugitive, eludes my capture, and lives in the air too briefly, as only a pure product of its occasion. For instance, many of us have been exposed to the dreaded Q&A session, in which, with luck and a fair wind, you just might be fortunate enough to take flight and utter something you'd never been able to conceive, let alone articulate, before, even though, once it's out, you will clean forget it. Nonetheless, in this idea of the decisive force of articulation itself, there might be something to shift those rather too neat alternatives of language as cited either inside the speaker or as really coming from the outside. And such speculations about how utterance relates to conceiving have had their intense airings in the philosophical past. It's hardly surprising, given their fiendishly scrupulous attention to each possible declension of the self as foundation, that German thinkers of the very late 18th and very early 19th centuries emphasized the nature of self-reflection, and occasionally to have concluded that here language itself can triumph over the deliberations of the speaker or the author. And so Novalis's brief monologue, written around 1798, includes these remarks. In speaking and in writing, something mad occurs. The true conversation is a pure play of words, precisely what is most characteristic of language, that it attends only to itself. Everybody ignores. As a result, it's a wondrous and fruitful mystery, to the point that if one speaks purely for the sake of speaking, one expresses the most splendid, the most original truths. But if a person wishes to speak of some particular thing, that capricious creature language has him say the most ridiculous and muddle-headed of stuff, which explains the hatred some serious people have for language. They see its mischievousness, but they don't see that contemptible chatter is the infinitely serious side of language. Novalis goes on. If in saying this I believe I've shown in the clearest way possible the essence and office of poetry, all the same I know that no one will be able to understand me, and I will have said something foolish precisely because I wanted to say it, so that no poetry has come out of it at all. But what if I were compelled to speak? What if this linguistic impulse to speak were the hallmark of the inspiration of language, of the operation of language in me? What if my will wanted only what I am compelled to do, might not this in the end, without my realizing or imagining it, be poetry and make a mystery of language comprehensible? And would I then be a writer by vocation, since a writer can only be someone who is possessed by language? Novalis' gaily phrased remarks on language as self-conversing certainly had his resonances for his contemporaries. So Heinrich von Kleist, the poet, dramatist, and essayist, noted, quote, "It is not we who know, but largely a certain condition of our mind which knows." Couldn't that remark be repurposed as, quote, "For it is not we who write, but largely a certain condition of our mind which writes"? Or perhaps better, no, I think far better would be this, quote, "For it is not we who write, but largely a certain condition of our ear which writes," which, as well offering the happy image of an inky earlobe, emphasizes the phenomenon of the inner sounding of others' words together with self-overhearing, which in my later talks I will pull back to the condition of lyric. But just to press on for a moment with Kleist. His life was almost as brief as that of his ally Novalis. He died when he was in his 30s, in 1811. I'd first come across his work when I'd been writing about inner speech. In his unfinished short but vivid essay written around 1805 or 1806 on the gradual production of thought while speaking, Kleist describes the productive force of a compelled utterance. And that is indeed social, even though its sociality is far from an orthodox kind. And in its uncontrollable explosion, we're liberated from that sometimes paralyzing inside versus outside impasse about its site. Kleist's essay claims that discovered and revealed thought happens on a furiously animated threshold, and utterance and its thought are produced together, purely in the act of voicing. In fact, we might consider these as hyphenated, as utterance-thoughts. That is, not as an exchange or communication or a discussion, but something much more like a wrenching into being before other people. Again, it's not a translation of some silent content of mental ease into a voice content, rather of an incalculable eruption as speech. So Kleist writes, "If there's something you wish to know and by meditation you can't find it, my advice to you, my ingenious old friend, is speak about it with the first acquaintance you encounter. He doesn't need to be especially perspicacious, nor do I mean that you should ask his opinion, not at all. On the contrary, you should yourself tell him at once what it is you wish to know. I see astonishment in your face." And then Kleist explains, "It's not by means of any reasoned conversation, but through the urgent need to wrestle something into speech before the speaker gets interrupted that he'll discover what he needs. For instance," he says, "by talking to his sister about a problem in algebra that he's struggling with when she's no mathematician, and anyway, she's trying to leave the room." He goes on, And in this process, nothing helps me more than if my sister makes a move suggesting she wishes to interrupt, since his fear of that redoubles his effort to get to a conclusion in time. He needs her to stay put. She can't help to solve his puzzle, but her purely physical presence is in some way vital for him to stumble upon his solution. So, it's not a question of sharing a topic, let alone of establishing any Socratic exchange, but of a one-sided, violent imperative, finally able to burst through. Reaching a new thought on your feet, Kleist implies, doesn't suggest that this thought had really been finished internally. On the contrary, he tells us how very dull the subsequent delivery of what's already been achieved in words in the mind can be. Quote, for then it's left with a mere expression of that thought, and this business, far from exciting the mind, has a relaxing effect. In short, there is iteration, but there is no discovery. Kleist describing a surprise that's both experienced and conceptual, the surprise of a breakthrough for the speaker, suddenly enunciating something that's new, even to herself. A radical aspect of Kleist's essay is that he's not describing shared communion with his audience. That's not his point. He's describing scenarios where the listeners are in the dark too. He's pointing to that thoroughly mysterious capacity of uttered language to run on its own track, not quote, a brake on the mind, but rather a second wheel running along parallel on the same axle. But he's well aware that the exciting autonomy of language can go wrong. There may well be unhappiness in forced speech, depending on the context. Kleist's short essay, though, is largely concerned to illuminate an unpremeditated inventiveness discovered as a fresh freedom. This speaking aloud before others is critical for finding out what you wanted to say, or as the Scots poet W.S. Graham put it, so lucidly and so economically, as is characteristic, quote, do not think you have to say anything back, but you do say something back, which I hear by the way I speak to you. There, Graham is naming something sharply true to familiar experience. You'll sense acutely your listener's attention, if it's there, not there in some vaguely benevolent, but in a more precise way. And more than that, this sensation is a determining part of what you yourself then become able to say. Being heard, not empathetically or sensitively listened to, but just rather literally and plainly heard, is germane to what is sayable. I've been dwelling on all of this because I'm coming to think that something analogous happens elsewhere in lyric poetry. For in writing lyric, you might well have a similar sensation of language racing ahead of you. The writing, so to speak, emerges in front of its author, as if it's unspooling itself. To wait with it, to let it speak out, requires a kind of blind faith. The poem as pure invocation is a calling out in the very faintest hope that a reply might be thrown back, even across hazardous, frozen or darkly remote terrain. Or perhaps the word invoke suggests a strange confidence in the sheer act of calling, even when you sense that you will not get any answer, or if there is an answer, it won't be exactly conversational. The champion of this glacial territory was once again W.S. Graham. His long sequence called Implements in Their Places has a great deal to say about writing as a kind of summoning across a void, and also as an intense listening to silence, of writing as an address which may hope for, yet doesn't expect a reply, but where the very act of straining to hear, even over an unfathomable distance, may tell the writer what he's looking for. Another stanza from the endlessly quotable Graham is this: I would like to speak in front of myself with all my ears alive and find out what it is I want. Such habits of acute self-listening and self-overhearing may, with luck, tell you something about what your writing is seeking. And I think this strongly recalls Kleist's assertions. For in a comparable vein, the poem won't only stand in front of the writer, but will speak in front of her to find out what it is that it wants. While the poet herself as a person must, at least in my own view, stay supremely uninteresting. The speaking poem will dart well ahead of its writer's formulations in order to find itself as poetry, not simply as a writing that's dictated by its author's prior thoughts. It needs to outrun her. It has to escape her plans and to foreground itself as a sheer event of language. From that unclouded vantage point, the poem can overhear itself and so shape itself. In the same breath as it feverishly corrects itself, it makes itself up. I know this seems a far-fetched way of talking, but to its author, even a poem's structure can have an anonymous feel in its self-founding composing. The literary critic, though, may generously assume that the writer has skillfully managed or quote-unquote crafted its poetical effects. Actually, these have enabled themselves. As for the work of editing, certainly a great deal of selecting and cutting goes on. But again, it's not the writer herself who's in full and sole command of such revising. Prosody is a range of poetic resources, including, of course, metre and cadence, is enormously present in enabling this task too of rewriting and of editing. Perhaps, though, some suspect that attending to prosody would condemn them to dully orthodox, metrically bound practice. Yet what's inherited by the poem isn't at all synonymous with what's culturally conservative, nor with literary nostalgia, let alone with archaism. And prosody itself is far more than its repertoire, its clusters of devices. It is layered consolidations of histories, of poetic forms, carrying the written voices of the long dead. Or to return to Graham, quote, "You must be faithful to who you are speaking from, and yet it is all right. You will be there." As to the related question of, then why doesn't everyone sound the same? Or how individual styles of poetry can exist if its writers are all in attendance before the broad onrush of language. Any personal, quote-unquote, personal authorship will always already be resonant with, be saturated with its own linguistic experiences and its idiosyncratic history of reading and listening. So you can't really set the writer's individuality against some literary outside, as if her interior verbal life were only a matter of her psychology, made manifest as her non-linguistic, pre-style way of being. It's not that a writer's individuating style is tacked onto her work's semantic content as some wondrously distinct embellishment of a signature. Perhaps we could say that differences in writerly styles broadly resemble the variations in styles of people. So by analogy, the genetics, so to speak, of style would be the inherited mutations and variations of poetry of the past, and the environment of style would be the poetic and broadly linguistic environment of the more recent present. As to the sheer grind of editing, Michel Foucault's remarks about archival research apply. Genealogy is grey, meticulous, and patiently documentary. It operates on a field of entangled and confused parchments, on documents that have been scratched over and recopied many times. Nonetheless, the writer's initial composing can't be contrasted cleanly to her later work of self-editing, because the poem is saturated by its prosody, which spills over into self-shaping. Yet we are not on any Yeatsian automatic writing territory here. This isn't a mystical, but a solidly pragmatic description of what you're likely to experience in the course of writing. There is a busily attentive editorial mind at work, but it too is, so to speak, the mind of language. Much as I hate repeatedly generalizing about language, and especially about poetry, I'll conclude with this tentative parallel between such philosophical and literary descriptions. What Kleist described about the generation of ideas in the course of speaking is also the enforced abandonment of any feeling of proprietorship, because you are outpaced. At such moments, an intensified, if impersonal, linguistic consciousness settles in. As spoken language overtakes and outruns its ostensible anchorage in the speaker. In that distinctive, if still mysterious way, she may find herself voicing new reflections from nowhere while, even if reluctantly she's before an audience, while the writer of poems may find fresh lines and phrases springing up while she's waiting, equally helplessly, equally blankly, before the expectant hugeness of the languages of poetry. Parallel to the way in which a surprising burst of articulacy can be engendered in a speaker who's face-to-face with a listening audience, a surprising rush of writing can flood through the poet face-to-face with her own audience, which consists of the poems of others, the living but, I think, more frequently the dead. A surge of echoic memory will tear across the writer unbidden and uncontrolled. Both these instances, the unanticipated speaking and the uncalculated writing, would require some new approach to the question of how linguistic inventiveness comes about. And it could slightly complicate the idea of authorial responsibility. Or more interestingly, it could renew a recognition of the need of lyric and of at least some of its writers for a quiet and tolerant waiting for a near anonymity in that process. Or to put it more vigorously, to frankly seize on occasions to become opaque, to be reticent, to vanish from time to time, to risk being viewed as not only willfully obscure, but downright slippery in defense of your invisibility. All of which runs sharply counter to the contemporary stress on the poet's singular mastery of her craft. That's one reason why craft is such an annoying term, almost as annoying as the term creativity, horrendously overworked. Craft also smacks of a nostalgically romanticized pre-industrial mode of production.
Wow.
Christ in his father's workshop, so to speak. On the contrary, to bring about the conditions for a lyric poem to emerge, it's more helpful to allow yourself to wait in a condition of attentive not knowing, in a listening ignorance. So thank you.